Toliver's Secret, Chapter 10. Now I want y'all to think, as you're coming to the end of this book, how hard it was for people back then. Farmers, people that lived off the land. They grew their own food, vegetables, meat, any kind they could get. Pigs, cows, chickens, milk. They had to milk their own cows, and cows had to be milked every day, every single day, every morning. You got to get up. Sometimes someone told me once, and I had never thought about this before, but you got to get up, and if you're going to be working in the fields to plant your wheat or your whatever it is that you're planting, your corn, anything, if you got mules to walk behind with your plow, you got to get up, 4 a.m., well before the sun rises, and you got to feed those mules. You got to get them all of their energy and their water and everything. You got to get them ready to go first. Then you get everything else ready to go. They had to build their own houses. If they had even if they had shelter for some of their animals, the horses. Now you're not gonna get a cow in the barn ever, but you would fence them in. But yet again, make your own fence, make your own shelter for you to live in. They had to make everything. Their lighting, there was no electricity, so they had to make their own candles. Everything had to be done on their own. And trust me, it's not easy building shelters. You think, oh, I'll just go get some wood and build something. It's not that easy. If they couldn't afford to go to the sawmill and buy lumber, then they were most of them were cutting timber down off of their own land and prepping it and making shelter for themselves and shelter for their animals. And trust me, that's no easy task, even when you're just buying lumber. We've bought barnwood before, and we've built our own chicken coops and our own pig pens and things like that. It's not easy. So think about how it would be another country coming in. So, I mean, obviously, America and the colonies and everything were occupied by the British. King George, he's the one. He wanted the land for himself. And people coming to America were wanting their own. That's why they came there. The land of the free. The land was fertile. Was good farming land. They could be free to practice their religion any way that they wanted to. But before that came about, it was occupied by the British. British governors ruled the towns. And they just came in and they just took what they wanted. So imagine working that hard for your land. You've got your land now, and you've built your home, and you've got your animals, and you've got your system, and it was hard, and you were hungry all the time. Just think, someone coming into your home and living in your house and taking all your stuff. Stuff that you'd worked very hard for. Times were way different back then, obviously. So, that is what drove the American people to fight against the British and gain our freedom. So, let's think about things like that as we're reading this book. And if you don't want to, always, if I'm rambling on about stuff, feel free, if you want to fast forward until the time when the video actually starts. Or click on this time that I'll post up. I'm just kidding. I see people do that. Click here and something magically appears for them to click. I don't know how to do that. We're just going to read. And we're going to read Chapter 10, Toliver's Secret. Backwards, but you can read this. Chapter 10, page 123. Hold back the night, hold back the night, Ellen said over and over as they ran along. She watched the trees stand black against the dull red sunset. Slowly the sky faded into gray and then turned into night. She thought anxiously of Mr. Shannon's courier and wondered how long he would wait. Was he watching the few stars that came out in the winter sky? It must be a long, long ride from Elizabeth to Pennsylvania. If the general was to have the message tomorrow, the first courier would have to start soon. Grandfather would have been there long ago had he come. It had grown very dark when Mr. Murdoch turned his head to her and spoke over his shoulder. "It's black as pitch. You better sleep in the loft with my boys tonight." "Oh, no," cried Ellen. "I couldn't do that." "How are you going to get to Elizabeth?" Ellen took a long breath. "Walk," she said in a very low voice. Then she remembered the coins in her pocket. "Mr. Murdoch," she said, "I can pay you to ride me to Elizabeth." Well, the farmer thought it over, but he said no more. "I have the money," Ellen urged him. "I'll give it all to you." Well, would he ever make up his mind? "You said it was only half a mile," she reminded him. "We'll see what Ma says first. I have to feed my cows in the woods, and they'll be bellowing to be milked. Then I have to round up my pigs and tie them up." Y'all, I didn't know how he would round up a pig with 2 young boys, even if he was doing it by himself. That's hard. Our pigs used to get out. Well, they do get out. And it takes 2 men to round them up and tie a rope around them. I mean, that can't be done. You have to corral them in, and they don't want to go back in the pen, nor do they want to be tied up. That's hard. "Then I have to round up my pigs and tie them up." "And then we could start?" asked Ellen. Top of page 125. "Well, Ma will be mighty mad if we don't sit down to her supper. Ma gets mad easy. But I reckon I can take you when I get through." Perhaps, Ellen thought, she'd better hurry on by herself. After all the trouble she had had today, it would be terrible if she missed the courier. But when she heard the lonesome howl of an animal far away, she changed her mind. Surely the courier would not start this early. "It won't be so late," she kept assuring herself. She could smell the wood smoke from the chimney before she saw the shadowy house near the road. It, too, was tightly closed with no light showing from the windows. "Well, we're here," said Mr. Murdoch as he turned through the gate. He tied the horse to a ring on the wall. "Open up, I'm home again," he shouted. The door was flung wide and 2 young boys ran out. In the dim light, Ellen could see a big black pig tied by his hind leg to a stake just outside the door. "Oh, Pa!" the boys shouted as they gathered up the baskets. "We found this mean old pig in the woods and tied him up." I mean, see, again, I'm sure back then those boys would have been able to do that, but that's hard. "Good," said the farmer. "We'll turn him into pork tomorrow," which is also hard. That's a task. A tall, lanky woman came to the door and held it open for them. Her eyes were hungry, and her face, beneath a ruffled white cape, looked as if it were hacked out of gray stone. She bounced a crying baby on her hip and slapped at a toddler tugging at her drooping skirt. "You're back at last," she snapped, and then, to Ellen's surprise, she burst into tears. "Thank the Lord for that," she said, as she roughly brushed the tears away with the back of her hand. Ellen followed Mr. Murdoch and the boys into the house. The woman did not seem to see her. She was scolding her husband as she hurried to the fireplace and picked up a big spoon. "In times like these, it ain't safe to ride to Amboy to sell leather. If you're dead, I got these 4 boys to raise." 4 boys. "The bootmaker paid me, and we need the money." Mr. Murdoch lifted his yellow beard and took some money from the bag that hung from a cord about his neck. "Nothing to be worried about." "Worried?" cried his wife in a high, shrill voice. "With all those redcoats around?" She banged her spoon as she stirred the pot of soup that hung over the fire. Her voice became low and firm. "Times were better before the war started. That's what I think." "Now, Ma, don't talk like that." Mr. Murdoch pushed Ellen forward, but his wife paid her no mind. As she stood waiting for the farmer's wife to notice her, Ellen looked around the log farmhouse. The whole house was just one big shadowy room, lighted by a fire on the hearth at one side. Pots and ladles and kettles of iron hung on hooks near the fireplace. In one corner stood a huge spinning wheel, and in another corner a big unmade bed with a trundle bed beneath it and a cradle beside it. When she saw that a ladder went up through a dark hole to the boys' beds in the loft, Ellen was glad she wasn't going to spend the night in that cold place. Mistress Murdoch was still upset as she put wooden bowls and earthen mugs on the table. I said times were better before the war started. Everything was peaceful, and we farmed our farm, and no soldiers bothered us. She banged the pitcher of milk on the table. I say King George was all right. He didn't bother us none. Why do we want to change things? Mr. Murdoch pushed Ellen toward the fire. He seemed to want to change the subject. I brought home a boy named Toliver, who's mighty hungry. Ellen remembered to snatch off her cap and stuff it in her pocket before she nodded her head politely, as a boy would have done. The farmer's wife looked at her glumly. Then she looked at the pot of stew and gave it a quick stir. That's enough, she said. There's enough, she said, if he ain't too hungry. Pa, go outside and hide your horse in the woods. Supper has waited long enough. With his wooden milk pail in his hand, Mr. Murdoch quickly pulled his cap over his bushy hair, hunched his shoulders, and stomped out the door. Boys, Mistress Murdoch ordered. Go help your pa. She pulled a bench up to the fire. Sit, she said to Ellen. Ellen hadn't known how hungry she was until she smelled that pot of stew. Meat and onions and turnips. What a wonderful supper for someone who hadn't eaten anything but oatcakes since early morning. She stuffed her mittens in one of her pockets and carefully untied the blue bundle. This bread can dry out here by the fire while I eat supper. It's my grandfather's loaf of bread, she explained to Mistress Murdoch. It fell in the water. The woman looked at it. It's right soggy, she said. Not good for much. She picked up the wet kerchief and spread it out on a dry pile of firewood. Your feet are soggy too, she said as she bent down to look at Ellen's shoes. And breeches! Faith, you're wet to the skin, she cried, wiping her hands on her apron. Take off those breeches, Toliver, she ordered. We'll hang them by the fire too. Take off her breeches? And risk that woman finding out she was a girl? Ellen was alarmed. How could she explain why she was dressed as a boy? Only spies and criminals went around pretending to be someone else. Oh, no, she cried in dismay. I'm going to Elizabethtown tonight. Elizabeth? The woman stared at her. Tonight? In the dark? In this kind of weather? You'd freeze to death. But I must go. Mr. Murdoch said he'd ride me there. Ride you to Elizabeth on a night like this? The farmer's wife clasped her hands to her head. What now? That man must have lost his wits. She gripped Ellen's shoulder roughly in her strong hand. Take off those breeches, boy. You're chilled to the bone. What ails you? Are you bashful? Ellen drew back. Someone is waiting for me, she began. Suddenly, the woman picked her up, tossed her on the bed, and started to peel off her wet breeches. Ellen kicked her legs and tried to squirm away. At that, the woman's face went white with anger. There will be no riding out where those soldiers are tonight, she said through her tight lips. If he gets shot, I've got 4 boys to raise, so you can take off those breeches and let them dry. He's not going to Elizabeth, and neither are you. In desperation, Ellen pushed the woman's hands away and grabbed the top of her breeches, and kicking her feet, she worked her way to the edge of the bed. Mistress Murdoch stepped back and looked at her. What's wrong with you, Toliver? She cried. Quickly, Ellen scrambled from the bed and ran for the door. She was glad to find out it was not bolted. She flung it open and darted out into the night, pulling up her breeches as she ran. Thank goodness she had not taken off her jacket or shoes. She flew through the gate and across the road and hid among the trees. It was not until the door swung closed and all was dark around her that she remembered. The loaf of bread. She had left it on the hearth. A wild fright came over her as she stood shivering in the dark, cold night. What could she do now? She couldn't tell Mr. Murdoch he was suspicious about the bread anyway, and she couldn't go back to the door. That stubborn woman might take away all her clothes and give her a cornmeal sack for a nightdress. She was shaking with cold and fear and anger. How could she have forgotten the bread that she had guarded so carefully all day? How could she have been so stupid? Then a square of light broke into the darkness, and there stood Mistress Murdoch in the open doorway. "Here, pig," said the woman as she flung Ellen's loaf to the pig. "Turn that soggy old bread into pork." The door slammed shut, and all was dark again. Ellen could hear the pig grunt and snuffle around. When he found the bread, he would gulp it up quickly. And in his greediness, he would swallow the snuff box too. Ellen was afraid of pigs. She always walked clear of those lean, hungry public pigs who wandered about the New York streets and ate garbage. She remembered the mean look of the pig who had chased her this morning. In class, guys, remind me, and I'll tell you a story about what happens to a kept pig, a domestic pig, like the ones that we raise, when they escape and go free. Someone told me, and I didn't believe it, so I researched and I found out. So remind me, guys, and I'll tell you in class. Okay, 132, second paragraph. But now there wasn't a second to lose. She had to get the bread. She could feel her kneecaps shaking, and she couldn't make them stop as she raced across the road. If only there was more light from the pale stars overhead. She put out her hands to grope for the pig's prickly back, and when she felt it, she ran her fingers down to his lowered head. But the thought of his sharp teeth made her snatch them away. The smell of him, the awful smell of him, made her gag. And they do stink, y'all. Again, she reached out her hands. He rumbled in his throat and gave her a shove with his hips. She ran her hands along his back again, and he snorted angrily. Now her eyes had grown used to the dark, and she could tell that the bread was already in his mouth. She must grab for it. There was nothing else to do. Quickly, she snapped her cap from her pocket and swished it across his eyes, back and forth across his eyes. The pig tossed his head and snorted in rage. It was a terrifying sound, but when Ellen saw the bread fall from his mouth, she scooped it up quickly and darted out of his way. She was glad he was tied to the stake and couldn't chase her. And believe it or not, pigs are fast and wily. As she raced through the gate and down the road, her feet barely touched the ground. She heard the door open, and Mistress Murdoch called out, "You all right, Pa? You got the boys there with you?" But Ellen didn't turn to look. Mistress Murdoch couldn't see her running down the road, for she was out of sight with the loaf of bread in her trembling arms. She knew Grandfather's snuff box was safe inside. She could feel with her fingers that there was only one bite gone, and not a very big bite at that. Since she had no kerchief to wrap around it, she tucked it under her jacket, where it sat like a lump of ice on her stomach.